The fourth and final day of the tour focused on the British and American sectors, more specifically the airborne operations, and one of the sites I was most excited to see is called Pegasus Bridge, which was a bridge that was captured by British paratroopers in gliders. And just across from the bridge was a famous cafe, the Café Gondry, which was family owned and operated in World War II, and the daughter of the original owners is still running it today. So one of the things I really wanted to do was get my picture taken with my British Airborne flag that I purchased in Arnhem in 2021 and sit down and have a coffee at the famous cafe. Of course, if you don't know all of this, it's just a cafe, and when it's the first place you're visiting in the morning, you're thinking of coffee as a necessity, and Garrett immortalized this moment with the following.
Party had been able to see and not see, and this is Café Gondry.
Oh, whoa.
We're gonna stop, don't worry.
Yeah.
We'll be there.
Coffee there?
Yes, you can have a coffee if you want to, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was already a bar in the 19th century. Right.
Wow.
So we're gonna park.
And surprisingly, it was about a half an hour to an hour before we actually got that coffee. We parked our car and then went immediately to the bridge and the glider site. So here is Pegasus Bridge, or at least the replacement bridge. And this is the opposite direction, still standing in the same place, but this is the pond, and it's still there 80 years later. And each of the glider sites where they landed has a memorial. And now, after visiting this location and seeing the ground, this is a really impressive feat of aviation because these gliders landed practically on top of each other without ramming into each other. The space between them was very, very narrow. So you can see two of the monuments here, and these are basically exactly where the gliders landed. And this is, of course, a photo of how it looked shortly after D-Day. We're standing in the spot where I think this glider is. And across the canal here is, or across the river, is the cafe. Here's a map of the area. So north, south, east, west. It's oriented correctly. And we are standing right at the apex of this triangle here, right at the point, and the cafe is across the bridge. So the objective was for these glidermen and paratroopers to capture these two bridges intact. This is the 50mm anti-tank gun and a Tobruk that was defending the bridge, same as it was 80 years ago. That is the exact same gun.
Okay. This was the first house probably bonjour madame, among the first ones, and you can also see here below that.
And here's the cafe. So I'm going to take a minute and tell the story of how I met Arlette Gondry, because it's kind of interesting what happened. So first I told the tour guide that I had my airborne flag and that if she was in, I was hoping she might sign it. He thought that was a cool idea, but he just let Garrett and I know ahead of time that she doesn't like it when people take videos or pictures inside the cafe. It's okay to do it outside, but she doesn't like it when it's done inside, so no problem, so far so good. When we went inside the cafe, she indeed was serving the coffee. She was behind the counter and everything, but when the tour guide spoke with her, she said that she actually wouldn't sign anything that wasn't from inside the cafe. So there's quite a bit of memorabilia that you could purchase there. And once that was communicated to me, I went outside and purchased a postcard off of this postcard rack with her mom and dad on it, picture of her mom and dad on there. And I walked back inside, bought us all coffees and the postcard, and then she signed it. Says best wishes, Arlette G. And as I went to pay, she started rattling off how much each item cost. And when she got to the end, I said, and how much is the signature? And Garrett and the tour guide were laughing, and I wanted to see if I could get her to smile, but instead she said, "The signature is free. I could charge for that, but the signature is free." She said this with a look of seriousness on her face, and at that point I was ready to call it quits and just enjoy my coffee outside. But then she turned to me and asked if we were in the military. I pointed to Garrett and said he was a Marine and that I was in the Army, and then she told me that she sometimes had U.S. soldiers coming from Germany visiting her cafe. I thanked her for the drinks and the signature, and we went outside and enjoyed our coffee at this little table right outside the window. And as odd and perhaps disappointing as that conversation was, I felt a little better when, in the process of making this video, I found this TripAdvisor review, and I'll just read this. It says, "Possibly the rudest person on the planet. The woman who owns and runs this cafe, daughter of the owner during the liberation, is quite possibly the rudest person I've had dealings with in a long time. Other colleagues had warned me about her on a previous school trip to Pegasus Bridge, so I had kept away from the cafe. I forgot their warnings this year and headed in for a coffee with a fluent French speaker. We both ordered in French. She answered in English. We tried to converse with her in French. She responded in English. Offhand, could barely be bothered to even look at us, and the coffee was disappointing too." There are other reviews like that, so perhaps I came off better than most. I'll note one last thing here. On the Pegasus Bridge Cafe sign, it says clearly, "English spoken." At any rate, there's a British Airborne Museum on the glider side of the river, and this is the original bridge, so it looks very much similar to the bridge there is today, but because it's essentially a historic artifact, they preserve it at this museum. This is a mock-up of a Horsa glider, the type that was used to assault the bridge on D-Day. And though it is a recreation, the wheels and tires are original. They were found by a French farmer. Okay. And from there, we moved to the Ranville battery. This is very similar to the Pointe-à-Hawk story. It's a 4-gun battery that needed to be knocked out in order to protect the British and Canadian landing beaches. So the British Airborne got tasked with knocking these guns out. And the abbreviated version of this story is that 700 British paratroopers were intended to be used in an assault on these guns, but only 150 formed up and showed up in order to do it. And in dramatic fashion, they did so. They lost about 50% of their number, but they got the job done. And the story and the artifacts here are pretty incredible.
The village of Merville, like it was, with its water tower, right? And here you find the area of these famous drops in V Victor, next to Varaville, where from Otway and his men from the 9th Parachute Battalion moved to the rear of the battery to launch the attack, as you saw. That is actually the River Dive in the distance, where these 5 bridges should be blown up. And much closer to us, we find the river and the water canal that in fact are on the other side, because Merville is on the other side. Battery defended by something like 120, some figures say 30 German soldiers, with the attack in the night with a slightly superior number of British soldiers. But they should have been way more than this.
Yeah.
And then the white arrows here show you the direction of attack on the rear of the German positions, with that point B here, which is where the only Vickers machine gun he had could provide some kind of a diversionary fire, even though the 2 main underground bunkers, this here and the other one over there, really were the main source of fire the British had to deal with their Tobruks and machine guns built on top. There was another one here, see, there's a mound of terrain here.
Yeah.
In fact, this is hiding another.
But the assault would have been mostly open ground?
From behind.
Yeah.
Through the open ground.
Right, there weren't a lot of trees back then for them to hide behind. Each bunker has been turned into a museum, and in one of the bunkers there's what our tour guide called a reenactment. And what it was mannequins with smoke machines, lights, and a very large sound system with a heavy bass. So it kind of played it out minute for minute, how the guns fired a few times on D-Day, and then the assault of the British paratroopers into the backs of the bunkers. It was a very dramatic reenactment and seemed very accurate. This is what the guns would have looked like before they were put into casemates. So through most of the early 40s, they were actually in the open air and were put into the casemates later in the war. This is a picture of a German glass mine. This was really interesting to me because of my time at sapper school. Glass is forbidden to be used in weapons of war because X-rays can't pick it up. Forbidden by the Geneva Convention. So this is really peculiar. And the tour guide rightly pointed out that this would not be picked up by metal detectors. After the Merville battery, we went to Ranville, which is one of the cities on that map. As you can see, it's just east of those bridges that we were at. The battery is actually north of there, so we went from Pegasus Bridge north to the Merville battery, then back south to Ranville. There was a church with more of the airborne stained glass, this time to commemorate the British liberating them. So you have the Pegasus. This also happened to be a Commonwealth cemetery, so this would be comparable to our American cemetery over Omaha Beach. And then we visited Longues-sur-Mer. This is 6 minutes from our hotel, so we have now driven back towards the middle of the invasion beaches. This is yet another 4-gun battery. One of the more interesting aspects to this story is that there was no plan to have these knocked out on D-Day. And when I asked our tour guide why there was no operation to destroy these guns like there was for the Americans and for the British in their respective sectors, he said that the cliff was too high to climb, but said nothing else. So the way that these guns were knocked out was by naval gunfire. American, British, and even some French ships got into gun duels with these until they were all silenced. The whole area was assaulted a couple days later, and the whole thing seemed pretty bloodless, which made me wonder, why was this battery ignored while the other two received such special attention? Anyway, here's another photograph. Very little has changed in 80 years, of course. The unique thing about this site is obviously the guns have been so well preserved and are essentially still in their same position from when they were on D-Day. This was an interesting photo because there are hobnails from the Germans who stepped on wet concrete when it was poured. This is the rear view of one of the guns. Another old photo. Another Tobruk, and then this is, we're moving closer to the water where there was another observation bunker, as you can see back here. So we took another picture from that observation bunker. And then we moved to one of the final locations on our tour, and this is Port and Besson. This is a map of the British beaches, but I'll just show Port and Besson is way over here on the left-hand side, and it is the dividing line between the British and American sectors. So that's why this little port is interesting. It was actually one of the D-Day objectives and missions of the Royal Commando, which landed with the 50th British on Gold Beach, to move, yeah, here it is, 47th Royal Commando, to move all the way over here to Port and Besson and capture the little town. And as you'll see, this is a really unrealistic objective. It's amazing that they got this far, because we are standing over the town just to the west on the American side, and I'm going to zoom in. Okay, and do you see these dark shapes here? This is the Mulberry Harbor at Gold Beach. In other words, that is the far western flank of the British beachhead. That's essentially where this line is right here, okay? That means those guys, the commandos, had to move from that position all the way towards basically where I'm standing and secure the town, possibly in combat, before nightfall. This is just nuts. That movement with the expectation of combat at the end, or high potential of combat. I asked our tour guide, was that really realistic? And he said there were a lot of unrealistic objectives on D-Day. And he meant more in the context of the geography that the Allied commanders expected to capture on the first day. Yeah, this is a very impressive amount of distance to cover. This is not something I would have realized by reading books, but by having walked the ground and visited the sites, it's a different story. This is a memorial to the 47th Commando, which assaulted and took the town. There's Garrett and I, again, kind of the same position with Gold Beach in the far background. And this was our final stop. This was a museum that we did not enter. It wasn't open, but our tour guide showed us this from the road. This is a French diver family that has pulled wrecked American vehicles from the water off Omaha Beach. There's a Sherman here. There's an M3 Stewart. There's actually a priest behind this piece of wood. And then there's a bulldozer Sherman here. And you can see the condition that they're in. It's almost creepy, but there was some other things obviously pulled out, some guns. There was even a ship's turbine pulled out of the water. And altogether it was a really interesting museum. And that concluded a really amazing tour of the Normandy battlefield. Of course, no trip to France is complete without a stop to the Eiffel Tower, so Garrett and I checked that box. On the way back, we had just enough time, about 20 or 30 minutes, to stop here and hang out and get our picture taken. Then we hopped on the plane and came home. That was the end of the fourth day and the end of our tour of the battlefields of Normandy.